called me the receptionist. The state records called me the co-founder. I want to start with that sentence, because for over 15 years, I helped build a modest neighborhood boxing gym into something genuinely respected within our entire community, working alongside my own father from the very first day we opened our doors, only to watch my brother, following our father's death, spend months quietly trying to convince everyone, including me, that I had simply been helping out at the front desk the whole time, rather than being exactly what the actual paperwork always said I was. I want to tell you how I finally reminded him, and everyone else, what that paperwork actually said, because I think, if you've ever poured years of genuine, foundational work into something only to have it quietly minimized once real stakes were involved, you already understand exactly the kind of clarity I eventually needed to reclaim. Hello, and welcome. This is a quiet place for stories about the work that goes unrecognized until the exact moment it becomes inconvenient for someone else to keep recognizing it, and the specific, undeniable proof that eventually sets the record straight. If any part of this story feels familiar to you, I hope you'll stay until the end. My name is Angela. I am 39 years old, and 15 years ago, my father and I opened a boxing and fitness gym together, a business we built from a single rented storefront into one of the most respected training facilities in our entire city, before his death revealed exactly how differently my own brother had always privately understood my role within it. I want to tell you about how this gym actually began, because I think understanding the genuine, foundational nature of my involvement from its very first day matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. My father, Frank, had boxed competitively in his own younger years, eventually transitioning into coaching after his own competitive career ended, training fighters out of a series of increasingly cramped, borrowed spaces throughout my entire childhood. I grew up literally inside boxing gyms, spending countless afternoons after school doing homework on a folding chair while my father worked with his fighters, absorbing, without ever fully realizing it at the time, the entire rhythm and discipline of what it actually takes to run this kind of demanding, specialized business. I remember specific details of those early borrowed spaces vividly: the particular smell of leather and sweat and chalk dust, the rhythmic sound of speed bags, and the sharper, heavier thud of heavy bags being worked by fighters twice my own size, my father's voice carrying across whatever space we happened to be renting that particular year, correcting a fighter's stance or offering the kind of steady, patient encouragement that eventually built him a genuine reputation throughout our local boxing community. I remember, too, the specific instability of those years: gyms that closed unexpectedly, landlords who raised rent beyond what my father's modest coaching income could sustain, a childhood punctuated by the particular anxiety of watching my father's genuine passion repeatedly constrained by circumstances entirely outside his own control. I want to tell you about the specific circumstances that led my father and me to formally open our own gym together, because understanding this decision matters enormously for everything that eventually unfolded. I was 24 years old, working at the time as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm, when my father approached me with a specific, considered proposal. He had finally saved enough, combined with a modest business loan, to lease and properly outfit a permanent space of his own, but he explained, directly, that he needed a genuine partner to handle everything he himself lacked, both the time and specific expertise to manage properly the actual business operations, the finances, the marketing, the countless administrative details that determine whether a small business genuinely survives or eventually fails. I remember the specific evening he first raised this proposal, both of us sitting in his own small apartment kitchen after I'd stopped by for dinner, a stack of bills and half-finished business plan sketches spread across the table between us. I remember him looking genuinely nervous, an unusual expression for a man who had spent decades confidently instructing fighters twice his own size. And I understood, even before he fully explained his proposal, that whatever he was about to ask carried genuine significance beyond simply an ordinary family conversation. I want to describe the specific conversation where my father made this proposal, because it represents the actual foundation of everything that eventually happened regarding our gym's ownership structure. I remember sitting with him at our own kitchen table, the same table where I'd done my childhood homework, surrounded by boxing magazines and training schedules, and I remember him telling me, directly, that he didn't want me simply working for him as an employee. He wanted a genuine partner, someone with an equal stake in whatever we managed to build together, understanding, he said, that a business built entirely on his own name alone would only ever be as strong as his own individual capacity, while a business built as a genuine partnership might actually have the chance to become something considerably larger and more lasting than either of us could build entirely alone. I remember his exact words that evening, delivered with a specific, unusual formality I recognized as reflecting how seriously he had thought through this particular proposal. He said, "Angela, I've watched you organize things your entire life. Our finances, my old training schedules, everything. I can teach fighters how to move. I can't build a business that survives me. I think you can do both, but only if it's genuinely yours too, not just something you're helping your old man with." I remember hearing this, a specific pride I hadn't fully expected, understanding that my father, a man I'd always admired primarily for his physical discipline and coaching expertise, had actually been paying careful, genuine attention to my own different, complementary strengths throughout my entire life. I want to tell you about the specific legal structure we established when we formally opened this gym, because this structure would eventually become the single most important piece of evidence in everything that happened years later. We formed a formal limited liability company, filed with our state Secretary of State office, with my father and me listed as equal 50% owners, a structure our own attorney at the time specifically recommended given that we were both contributing meaningful capital and equally meaningful, if genuinely different, forms of labor and expertise to the business's formation and ongoing operation. I remember the specific afternoon we finalized these formation documents, sitting together in our attorney's modest office, my father signing his own name with the same careful, deliberate precision he brought to demonstrating a proper boxing stance, and I remember the particular pride I felt signing my own name directly beside his, understanding, in that specific moment, that I was becoming something considerably more significant than simply my father's helper. Our attorney, an older, methodical man who had handled several other small business formations throughout our neighborhood, specifically walked us through exactly what this equal ownership structure legally meant, explaining in detail that both of us would hold identical legal authority regarding any major decisions affecting the business, a detail my father nodded along to with visible, genuine satisfaction. I want to tell you about my brother, Kevin, because understanding his own relationship to our family and to this gym throughout the following years matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. Kevin is 4 years older than me, and he had never shown particular interest in our father's boxing world throughout our shared childhood, pursuing instead a considerably different path, eventually building a career in corporate sales that took him, over the following years, increasingly far from both our family's specific interests and, eventually, our actual physical proximity, settling nearly 3 hours away in a different city entirely. I remember Kevin's own childhood relationship to our father's boxing world with a specific, somewhat wistful clarity, watching him decline, year after year, our father's gentle invitations to try training himself, gravitating instead toward team sports at school and, eventually, the specific ambition that would define his entire adult career, a genuine, sustained drive toward corporate success that felt, even in his own teenage years, considerably removed from the modest, physically demanding world our father had built his entire identity around. I don't think this early divergence reflected any particular rejection of our father specifically, simply the ordinary reality of two siblings developing genuinely different interests and ambitions, though I think, looking back now, this early distance likely planted the first seeds of the specific misunderstanding that would eventually cause so much difficulty between us. I want to describe my brother's specific relationship to our gym throughout the following 15 years, because understanding this genuine distance matters for everything that eventually happened. Kevin visited the gym only occasionally throughout its entire 15-year history, typically during holiday visits home, and I want to be honest that his interactions with the actual business always carried a specific, subtle dismissiveness, a general sense that our modest neighborhood gym, however meaningful it was to our father and me, represented a considerably smaller, less impressive achievement than his own corporate career trajectory. I remember one particular Thanksgiving visit, perhaps 5 or 6 years into the gym's operation, when Kevin stopped by briefly on his way to our parents' house, glancing around our newly expanded training floor with a polite but clearly unimpressed expression, commenting that it must be nice to keep busy with something like this, before quickly moving the conversation toward his own recent promotion and the specific new accounts he'd secured that quarter. I remember feeling, even then, years before anything explosive would eventually happen, a specific, familiar sting at this kind of comment, understanding that Kevin genuinely seemed to view our gym as a modest hobby our father happened to also earn a living from, rather than the genuinely demanding, strategically complex business I understood myself to be building alongside him. I want to tell you about the specific roles our father and I each took on in the gym's daily operations, because understanding this genuine division of labor matters enormously for understanding exactly how unfair the later minimization of my contribution actually was. My father handled the actual training and coaching, working directly with our members and competitive fighters, maintaining the specific technical expertise and personal relationships that gave our gym its genuine reputation within the local boxing community. But I managed everything else: our finances, our membership systems, our marketing and community outreach, the countless administrative decisions that determine whether a small, specialized fitness business genuinely survives beyond its first difficult years. I remember the specific texture of my own daily work throughout those early years, arriving before our official opening time to handle bookkeeping and payroll for our small coaching staff, managing our membership renewal system I built from scratch using a modest software program I taught myself to use through countless evening tutorials, personally designing our first proper marketing materials after our old hand-drawn flyers finally felt too unprofessional for the growing membership base we were trying to attract. I remember specific late nights working through our tax filings, understanding that whatever genuine passion my father brought to training fighters, our business's actual survival depended considerably on the unglamorous, sustained administrative discipline I brought to managing everything else. I want to tell you about our gym's gradual growth over these 15 years because understanding this genuine, sustained success matters enormously for understanding exactly what was actually at stake in everything that eventually happened. We began in a single rented storefront, barely large enough for 2 full-sized boxing rings, gradually expanding, over the following decade, into an adjacent unit, eventually offering not just competitive boxing training but a broader range of fitness classes that considerably expanded our membership base and overall revenue. Growth I personally drove through careful market research, strategic pricing decisions, and the kind of sustained community relationship building that turned our modest gym into a genuine neighborhood institution. I remember the specific negotiation process for expanding into that adjacent unit, spending nearly 3 months researching comparable lease rates throughout our neighborhood, building a detailed financial projection to present to our landlord justifying why this expansion made genuine business sense, work my father genuinely appreciated but that I want to be honest, he never fully understood the specific complexity of, trusting me, almost entirely to handle these strategic decisions independently, while he continued focusing on the training work he genuinely loved most. I want to tell you about my father's declining health in his final years, because understanding this period matters enormously for everything that eventually happened following his death. My father developed a serious heart condition approximately 3 years before his eventual death, a diagnosis that gradually reduced his own direct involvement in the gym's daily training operations, requiring me to take on increasing responsibility, not just for our business operations, but for significant portions of our coaching staff management as well, hiring and training additional coaches to help cover the training responsibilities my father could no longer sustain himself. I remember those 3 years with a particular, complicated intensity, watching my father, a man who had always seemed genuinely indestructible throughout my entire childhood, gradually forced to accept increasingly significant limitations on his own physical capacity, unable, eventually, to demonstrate technique himself the way he once had, relying instead on careful verbal instruction, while our younger coaches handled the physical demonstrations his own body could no longer safely manage. I remember specific afternoons finding him sitting quietly in our small office between training sessions, visibly exhausted in a way that frightened me considerably more than he ever let on himself, and I remember taking on, without much explicit discussion between us, an increasing share of decisions that had previously been his alone to make, understanding that our partnership's actual balance was shifting even as our formal, legal structure remained exactly the same. I want to tell you about my father's actual passing, because understanding the immediate aftermath matters enormously for everything that eventually unfolded regarding the gym's ownership. My father passed away 18 months ago, a sudden complication related to his ongoing heart condition that, while not entirely unexpected given his diagnosis, still arrived with a specific, devastating suddenness that left our entire family, and our broader gym community, genuinely reeling. I remember the specific morning I received the call, standing in our gym's small office preparing our weekly staff schedule, a genuinely ordinary task interrupted by news that reorganized everything about my own understanding of what an ordinary day could suddenly become. I remember driving to the hospital in a kind of numb, mechanical daze, and I remember, in the immediate hours following his death, feeling a strange, disorienting responsibility settle over me almost immediately, understanding that beyond my own personal grief, I would also need to hold our entire gym community, coaches, members, competitive fighters who had trained under my father for years, through their own collective shock and loss. I want to walk you through the immediate weeks following his death, because understanding exactly how Kevin's involvement in the gym's affairs began matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. Kevin returned home for the funeral, staying considerably longer than his usual brief holiday visits, and I want to be honest that I genuinely welcomed his extended presence during those difficult weeks, grateful for whatever family support he could offer as we both navigated our shared grief. I want to tell you about the specific conversation where Kevin first raised questions about the gym's ownership and future, because understanding the exact framing he used matters enormously for everything that eventually unfolded. Approximately 3 weeks after the funeral, Kevin sat down with me, explaining that he had been thinking considerably about the gym's future, and that he believed, given our father's passing, it might make sense to consider selling the business entirely, understanding, he said, that running a specialized fitness business likely represented more ongoing burden than either of us genuinely wanted to continue carrying long-term. I remember that conversation taking place at our parents' own kitchen table, considerably quieter than usual, with our mother having passed years earlier, just the two of us sitting across from each other in a house that suddenly felt too large and too silent. I remember Kevin's tone throughout this conversation, careful and considerate in a way that genuinely surprised me given his historically distant relationship to the gym, and I remember initially appreciating what I understood, at the time, as genuine, thoughtful concern for my own long-term well-being rather than any dismissiveness toward what our father and I had actually built together. I want to describe my reaction to this initial suggestion, because I think understanding my genuine, immediate response matters for everything that eventually happened. I told Kevin, directly, that I had no interest in selling the gym, explaining that this business represented not simply our father's legacy, but my own genuine ongoing career and livelihood, built through 15 years of my own sustained, dedicated labor. I want to be honest that I initially believed this conversation had reached a reasonable, if not entirely satisfying resolution, Kevin acknowledging my perspective even if he personally would have preferred a different outcome. I remember driving home that evening feeling a specific, cautious relief, understanding that whatever brief tension this conversation had introduced, it seemed, at the time, like exactly the kind of reasonable, if uncomfortable, family disagreement that eventually resolves itself once both parties have had the chance to fully express their own perspective. I remember calling a close friend that same night, describing the conversation almost entirely in passing, mentioning it as one small, manageable difficulty amid the broader, more significant grief of losing our father, genuinely unaware that Kevin had already, quietly, begun taking steps that directly contradicted the understanding I believed we had reached together. I want to tell you about what I eventually discovered Kevin had actually been doing behind the scenes, because this discovery represents the actual beginning of everything that eventually unfolded. Approximately 2 months after this initial conversation, I received a call from our gym's landlord, asking whether I could clarify some unusual correspondence he had recently received regarding a potential change in our lease's ownership structure. Correspondence that had apparently been initiated using our business's official information, but that our landlord had no record of me personally authorizing. I remember taking this call in our gym's small office, mid-afternoon, on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday, our landlord's voice carrying the specific, mildly confused tone of someone raising a genuinely routine administrative question rather than anything he understood, at the time, to be particularly significant. I remember the specific, cold uncertainty that settled over me almost immediately as he described the correspondence, a feeling I recognized, even before he finished explaining, as the particular dread of understanding that something significant had likely been happening entirely without my knowledge. I want to describe this specific phone call because it represents the actual beginning of everything I eventually discovered. I told our landlord I had no knowledge of any such correspondence, and I remember a specific, cold uncertainty settling over me as we discussed this together, both of us genuinely puzzled about what these communications might actually represent, given that I, as the gym's primary operational manager, had initiated no such process myself. I remember our landlord, a genuinely kind man named Mr. Osei, who had rented to our father and me since our very first lease agreement 15 years earlier, sounding genuinely apologetic on the phone, explaining that he had simply assumed, given the correspondence's professional, confident tone, that this represented some kind of ordinary internal family decision he wasn't privy to the full details of. I remember him offering, before we even finished our conversation, to forward me copies of everything he had received, understanding, I think, from the particular tension in my own voice, that whatever was actually happening likely required my own immediate careful attention. I want to tell you about the specific investigation I conducted following this phone call, because understanding exactly how I approached uncovering the full truth matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. I contacted our landlord directly, requesting copies of this specific correspondence, and I want to describe what I discovered, because it represents the moment everything I'd believed about Kevin's acceptance of my ownership fundamentally shifted. The correspondence, it turned out, had been initiated by Kevin directly, presenting himself to our landlord as our father's sole surviving heir and, by extension, the gym's sole rightful owner, requesting information regarding the process for either transferring or terminating our current lease, apparently exploring, quietly, whether he could unilaterally pursue selling the business's physical assets and equipment even without my own direct involvement or consent. I remember reading through the printed copies our landlord eventually provided, Kevin's own careful professional language throughout these emails striking me with a specific, particular pain, the same polished, confident tone I imagine he uses closing corporate sales deals, applied now toward quietly exploring how to dismantle something I had spent 15 years of my own life building. I remember one specific line from an early email that stayed with me for weeks afterward, Kevin describing himself as the primary decision-maker regarding my father's business interests, a characterization that revealed, with unmistakable clarity, exactly how he had continued privately understanding our respective roles despite our earlier conversation that I had genuinely believed represented mutual settled understanding. I want to describe my reaction to learning this specific detail because it represents the actual moment I understood something considerably more troubling than a simple, resolved family disagreement was actually occurring. I sat in my own small office at the gym, phone still in my hand, feeling a specific, disorienting shock as I understood that Kevin had apparently, quietly, been exploring how to sell a business I held equal, documented ownership in, entirely without my knowledge, despite our earlier conversation that I had genuinely believed represented a settled, mutual understanding regarding the gym's future. I want to tell you about the specific steps I took following this discovery, because understanding exactly how I approached investigating this situation further matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. I contacted Kevin directly, explaining what I had learned from our landlord and asking him, calmly but directly, to explain exactly what this correspondence actually represented. I want to describe Kevin's initial response because understanding his specific reaction matters for everything that eventually unfolded. Kevin, After an initial pause that told me he recognized immediately what specific information I had discovered, explained that he had, in fact, been exploring the gym's potential sale independently, explaining that he believed, as our father's eldest child, he held primary authority over decisions regarding our father's business legacy. An explanation that revealed, unmistakably, exactly how he had always privately understood my own role within this business, regardless of whatever formal ownership structure our father and I had actually established years earlier. I remember making this call from the same small office where I'd received our landlord's original phone call, understanding some instinctive need to have this difficult conversation in the actual physical space, whose future was apparently being quietly decided without my knowledge. I remember the specific quality of silence on Kevin's end of the line when I first raised what I'd learned, a pause considerably longer than his usual confident, quick responses typically allowed, and I remember understanding, even before he said a single word, that whatever explanation was coming would not be a simple, innocent one. I want to describe my reaction to this explanation, because I think understanding my genuine, immediate response matters for understanding everything that eventually happened. I told Kevin, directly, that our father and I had formed our gym as a legal, equal partnership 15 years earlier, a structure that made me a full 50% owner, and that his own assumption regarding primary inheritance authority simply had no basis in the business's actual, documented legal structure. I remember the specific, disbelieving silence that followed this correction, Kevin apparently genuinely surprised to learn that any formal ownership structure beyond our father's individual name had ever actually existed, a surprise that told me, with painful clarity, exactly how little he had ever actually thought about the specific mechanics of how our business had been built and maintained over the preceding 15 years. I remember him asking, somewhat defensively, why he had never been told about this arrangement before, a question that struck me as genuinely revealing, understanding that our father and I had simply never seen any particular reason to formally announce our partnership structure to Kevin, given that it had never once, throughout 15 years, seemed relevant to any conversation we'd previously had as a family. I want to tell you about Kevin's specific response to this correction, because understanding his reaction reveals something important about how he had genuinely, apparently understood my role throughout the gym's entire 15-year history. Kevin responded, with what struck me as genuine, if misguided, confidence, that he had always understood me as essentially managing the gym's front desk and administrative operations on our father's behalf, a role he characterized as significant but ultimately subordinate to what he described as our father's fundamental ownership and vision for the business, an explanation that suggested he had, apparently, never actually understood or perhaps simply never chosen to acknowledge the genuine, equal partnership our father had specifically, deliberately established with me from the business's very first day. I remember his specific phrase during this explanation, describing me as someone who had always kept things running smoothly for our father, language that, however well-intentioned, reduced 15 years of strategic decision-making, financial management, and sustained business growth into something considerably smaller and more passive than what I had actually built. I remember feeling, hearing this description, a specific, familiar frustration, the same particular sting I imagine countless women feel when genuine, foundational contributions get quietly recategorized as simple, supportive assistance, regardless of how much actual strategic thinking and sustained effort that contribution genuinely required. I want to tell you about the specific decision I made regarding how to approach this discovery, because understanding my careful, deliberate process matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. I decided to contact an attorney immediately, a careful, experienced woman named Ms. Delgado, who specialized specifically in small business ownership disputes, explaining the full situation and requesting formal guidance regarding exactly what legal protections my documented ownership stake actually provided. I remember my first meeting with Ms. Delgado, bringing with me a folder containing our original LLC formation documents, which I had kept carefully preserved among my own personal records ever since my father and I first established this structure 15 years earlier. I remember her reviewing these documents with the same careful, methodical attention I imagined she brought to every client's situation, occasionally making notes, before finally looking up with an expression I recognized, with considerable relief, as genuine professional confidence rather than uncertainty. I want to tell you what Ms. Delgado explained, because her guidance clarified something critically important about exactly how secure my own legal position actually was, regardless of whatever assumptions Kevin had apparently maintained throughout the preceding 15 years. She explained that our original LLC formation documents, formally filed with the state 15 years earlier and consistently reflected in every subsequent annual filing and tax return since, established my own 50% ownership beyond any reasonable dispute, meaning that Kevin held absolutely no legal authority to pursue any sale or transfer of the business without my own explicit, documented consent, regardless of his own status as our father's surviving son. I remember Ms. Delgado walking me through the specific inheritance law that applied to our situation, explaining that even though our father's own 50% share would technically pass through his estate to his legal heirs, this inheritance affected only his individual ownership portion, never my own separate, independently documented 50% stake, a distinction Kevin had apparently never fully understood, or perhaps simply never taken the time to properly investigate before beginning his own quiet exploration of a potential sale. She also explained that even regarding our father's own 50% share, any decision affecting the business as a whole would still require my own consent as an equal co-owner, meaning that Kevin's entire premise for unilateral action rested on a fundamental misunderstanding of how our partnership's ownership structure had always actually worked. I want to describe learning this specific legal detail because it represents the moment I understood that whatever confusion or misunderstanding Kevin had genuinely carried throughout the years, his entire premise for pursuing a unilateral sale rested on assumptions that had never actually reflected the business's genuine, legal reality. I felt, upon learning this detail, a considerable, genuine relief alongside my continued frustration, understanding that our father's original, careful decision to formally structure our partnership as a legal, equal ownership arrangement had provided exactly the protection that would now prevent Kevin from pursuing any sale I had never actually agreed to. I want to tell you about the specific conversation I eventually had with Kevin, because it represents, I think, the actual climax of this entire story. I requested a formal meeting with him, held at the gym itself rather than any neutral location, understanding that I wanted this conversation to unfold in the specific place whose future we were actually discussing, surrounded by everything our father and I had actually built together. I remember calling Kevin to arrange this meeting, deliberately choosing a Sunday afternoon when our gym would be relatively quiet, most of our regular classes finished for the day, only a handful of members working independently in the far corner of our training floor. I remember his voice carrying a specific, cautious uncertainty when I proposed meeting at the gym specifically, understanding, I think, that this choice of location carried its own quiet significance, an implicit invitation for him to actually see, firsthand, what he had been so casually considering selling. I did not raise my voice through any part of this conversation. I had learned, through everything this particular discovery had taught me, that the truth, properly documented and calmly presented, rarely needs volume to be genuinely effective. I began by bringing Kevin into our gym's small trophy case, a modest glass display near our front entrance holding photographs and small awards accumulated over our 15 years of operation, evidence of the countless local competitions our trained fighters had participated in, and I asked him, directly, whether he genuinely believed everything displayed in that case represented simply our father's individual achievement, or whether he could actually recognize, looking carefully at those photographs, the countless specific decisions, sponsorships, community partnerships, and strategic choices that had required my own equal, ongoing involvement to actually accomplish. I remember the specific quality of afternoon light coming through our gym's front windows that day, catching the glass of that trophy case at a particular angle, our members' ordinary training sounds continuing in the background, the rhythmic thud of gloves against heavy bags, a sound I had grown so accustomed to over 15 years that I barely consciously registered it anymore, except in moments like this one, when its steady, familiar presence felt like its own kind of quiet witness to everything Kevin and I were actually discussing. I remember pointing specifically to a photograph from our very first local sponsorship event, an evening I had personally organized, calling dozens of local businesses myself until I finally secured our gym's first meaningful community partnership. A photograph that showed our father shaking hands with a local business owner while I stood, mostly out of frame, having arranged the entire event myself. I want to describe Kevin's reaction to this specific question because it represents the actual turning point of our entire confrontation. Kevin stood quietly in front of that trophy case for a considerable time, studying photographs he had genuinely never looked at closely before. Evidence, I understood watching him, of exactly how little attention he had ever actually paid to the specific, accumulated texture of what our father and I had actually built together over 15 years, rather than the simplified, distant impression he had apparently carried throughout most of his own adult life. I want to tell you what Kevin eventually said, because his response represents an important, if imperfect, beginning toward genuine reconciliation. He told me, quietly, that he genuinely hadn't understood, until standing in front of that specific case, exactly how much sustained, detailed work had actually gone into building what our father and I had created together, admitting that his own limited, occasional visits over the years had never given him any real opportunity to understand the gym's actual, day-to-day operation beyond his father's visible presence in the training room itself. I remember Kevin's voice cracking slightly, as he continued, admitting that he had spent most of his adult life assuming, without ever really examining that assumption, that our father's coaching represented the entire substance of the business, and that whatever I did each day amounted to simple, supportive administrative work rather than the genuine strategic partnership our father had actually established with me from the very beginning. I remember him asking, quietly, whether I could show him more, and I remember spending the following hour walking him through our actual financial records, our membership growth charts, the specific marketing decisions and community partnerships that had built our gym's genuine reputation, watching his own understanding visibly shift with each new piece of concrete, documented evidence. I want to tell you about the specific resolution we eventually reached, because I think it represents a genuinely thoughtful, if imperfect, path toward addressing what had happened. I proposed, rather than continuing any further dispute regarding the business's ownership or future, that Kevin formally, explicitly acknowledge my own equal ownership stake in writing, a document Ms. Delgado helped draft specifically confirming his understanding and acceptance of our original partnership structure, while also proposing that we establish a clear, formal agreement regarding how our father's remaining personal estate, separate entirely from the gym's business ownership, would be divided between us. I remember presenting this specific proposal to Kevin during a follow-up conversation about a week after our initial confrontation in front of the trophy case, both of us considerably calmer and more measured than during our earlier, more raw exchanges. I remember him reading through the draft document Ms. Delgado had prepared carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions, and I remember a specific, quiet relief watching him sign it without any further resistance, understanding that whatever painful weeks had led us to this moment, we had at least arrived at a resolution built on genuine, documented clarity rather than continued ambiguity or dispute. I want to describe Kevin's reaction to this specific proposal because understanding his eventual response matters for the full resolution of this entire story. Kevin agreed to this proposal, and I want to be honest that our subsequent conversations, working through the specific details of our father's broader estate, unfolded with a considerably more genuine, respectful collaboration than anything we had managed throughout the preceding difficult months. Evidence, I believe, that his earlier assumptions had genuinely shifted once he finally, properly understood the actual reality of what our partnership had always represented. I want to be honest with you about how I feel now, several months removed from that conversation in front of our gym's trophy case. I do not feel simple, uncomplicated triumph, the way you might expect from a story that resolves this clearly through documented legal ownership. I feel instead something considerably more complicated, genuine relief that our gym's future remains secure under my own continued stewardship, alongside real, ongoing grief that my own brother had spent 15 years genuinely, if unconsciously, minimizing my role within something I had dedicated my entire adult career to building. Kevin has visited the gym twice since this entire situation unfolded, considerably more often than his previous years of occasional holiday appearances, and I want to be honest that these visits carry a genuinely different quality now. Kevin asking specific, curious questions about our membership programs, our coaching staff, the countless operational details he had never previously thought to inquire about. I remember his most recent visit, watching him actually sit through an entire evening training class rather than simply passing through briefly, and I remember him telling me afterward that he finally understood why I had built my entire career around this specific business, rather than pursuing something he might have once considered more conventionally impressive. I remember, during that same visit, Kevin asking whether he could bring his own 2 children, my niece and nephew, to visit the gym sometime, children who had met their grandfather only a handful of times throughout their own young lives given our family's geographic distance. I remember feeling a specific, unexpected warmth at this request, understanding it as evidence that Kevin genuinely wanted his own children to understand something real about the grandfather they'd barely known, and about the specific legacy our father and I had actually built together. I've since hosted several afternoons with my niece and nephew at the gym, teaching them basic boxing fundamentals the same patient way my own father once taught me, understanding it as its own small, meaningful way of ensuring our father's genuine legacy continues extending forward, regardless of everything difficult that happened in the months immediately following his death. Our relationship remains, I want to be honest, still finding its own new footing, considerably more careful and deliberate than our previous, more distant sibling dynamic, but genuinely warmer, I believe, than what we shared throughout most of our actual adult lives before our father's death forced this entire reckoning between us. I want to tell you about the specific changes I've made to our gym since this entire situation unfolded, because understanding these changes matters for the complete resolution of this story. I formally updated our gym's public materials, our website, our promotional materials, our own physical signage, to clearly, explicitly credit both my father and myself as co-founders. A specific, deliberate correction I made, not out of any need for public validation, but out of a genuine commitment to ensuring our gym's actual history is accurately, completely represented going forward, rather than allowing the same kind of quiet minimization that had shaped Kevin's own understanding to persist within our broader community's collective memory of how this business actually came to exist. I remember the specific afternoon our new sign was installed above our front entrance, reading simply, "Founded by Frank and Angela Martinez," replacing an older sign that had, admittedly, only ever featured my father's name alone, a choice made years earlier when we first opened, and I, genuinely, hadn't yet fully understood how significant that specific omission would eventually become. I remember standing outside watching the installation, feeling a specific, quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with proving anything to Kevin specifically, and everything to do with finally, publicly, honoring the actual truth of what our father and I had built together, side by side, for 15 consistent years. I also began, in the months since this situation resolved, mentoring several younger women who had joined our gym's coaching staff, understanding, I think, a specific new commitment to ensuring their own contributions, whatever form those contributions eventually take, remain clearly, properly documented and recognized from the very beginning of their own careers, rather than requiring the kind of difficult, belated correction I found myself needing to pursue. I remember one specific conversation with a young coach named Priya, who joined our staff shortly before my father's passing, and who watched, with quiet attention, much of this entire situation unfold over the following months. I remember her asking me, directly, what advice I would offer someone just beginning to build something significant alongside a partner or family member, and I remember telling her, without much hesitation, that whatever genuine trust and goodwill exists in the moment, formal documentation should never be treated as an afterthought, understanding that the people who love us most today are not always the same people who will need to be legally, unmistakably reminded of our genuine contribution years down the road. I think about that conversation often now, understanding it as one small, meaningful way this entire difficult experience has continued extending its lessons outward, well beyond simply my own personal resolution with Kevin. If there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it is this. Formal, Documented ownership structures matter enormously, even within families where genuine love and connection might seem, on the surface, sufficient to protect everyone's understanding of a shared legacy's actual history. Our father's careful, deliberate decision to formally structure our partnership as equal legal owners ultimately provided the exact protection that prevented a sale I had never actually agreed to, regardless of whatever assumptions my own brother had genuinely carried for years. Here is a second truth I have carried with me since that conversation in front of our trophy case. People sometimes maintain confident assumptions about our role in something significant, not out of any deliberate malice, but simply because they've never taken the time to genuinely, closely examine the actual, accumulated evidence of what our specific contribution actually involved. Kevin's assumption about my role wasn't built on cruelty. It was built on simple, sustained distance and a lack of genuine curiosity about details he'd never previously felt the need to closely examine. Here is a third truth. Genuine partnership requires more than simply working alongside someone toward a shared goal. It requires ensuring that the formal legal structure of that partnership actually reflects both parties' genuine, equal contribution clearly enough to survive any future dispute, regardless of how unlikely such a dispute might feel during the genuinely collaborative early years of building something together. Here is a fourth truth. Quiet vindication does not require punishing the people who initially doubted or dismissed our genuine contribution. I chose to resolve this situation through calm, documented conversation rather than any prolonged legal battle, understanding that preserving whatever remained of my relationship with my only sibling mattered considerably more to me than extracting maximum consequence for his initial, misguided assumptions. Here is a fifth truth, one I didn't fully appreciate until watching that new sign installed above our entrance. Sometimes correcting the historical record matters just as much for the broader community around us as it does for our own personal vindication, ensuring that everyone who walks through our doors going forward understands the genuine, complete truth of what was actually built here, rather than the simplified, incomplete version that had unintentionally persisted for years. And here is the last truth I want to leave you with. Sometimes the people who love us most carefully prepare protections for our future decades before we ever actually need them, understanding, with remarkable foresight, exactly what challenges we might eventually face. My father's decision to formally structure our partnership as equal owners, made specifically to ensure my own genuine contribution would always be legally, unmistakably recognized, ultimately provided the exact foundation that preserved everything we had spent 15 years building together. That is my story. 15 years of genuinely equal partnership, one landlord's routine question about unusual correspondence, and one quiet conversation in front of a modest trophy case that finally proved exactly whose sustained, dedicated work had actually built everything displayed inside it. I think, sometimes, about that very first kitchen table conversation with my father, both of us barely imagining, at the time, exactly what 15 years of shared, dedicated work would eventually build together. I don't regret a single one of those years, even now, even knowing everything that eventually happened after his death. I think it's possible to hold multiple truths simultaneously, that our partnership was genuinely, completely equal in every way that actually mattered, and that my own brother, for reasons rooted more in distance and unexamined assumption than genuine cruelty, still managed to cause real, unnecessary harm before finally, properly understanding the truth. I still walk past that trophy case every single morning when I open our gym, considerably more often now stopping to actually look at it closely, understanding, finally, that every single photograph inside represents not simply our father's individual achievement, but the genuine, equal partnership we built together, one that survived his death, one difficult family confrontation, and now stands, considerably stronger and more honestly documented than ever before, ready for whatever comes next. I added one new photograph to that case myself, several months ago, a picture taken the afternoon our new sign was installed, both my father's name and my own finally displayed together above our entrance exactly as they always should have been. I look at that photograph most mornings, understanding it as a small, quiet reminder that some corrections, however long they take to finally arrive, are always worth the patient, careful work required to make them right. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that your genuine contributions deserve to be formally documented and protected, I would love to hear from you. Tell me, in your own words, about a time your own role in something significant was quietly minimized by people who should have known better. If this helped you tonight, a simple like lets me know these stories are genuinely worth continuing to tell. Thank you for spending this time with me. I will see you in the next story.